In this pygame tutorial on projectiles, we'll be covering two different types of projectiles. The first projectile is the very basic type that can move either in a horizontal or vertical direction. Then we'll be looking at a projectile that is fired at an angle between two coordinate positions. So this might be between where the player is located and where the mouse is located. So now we will look at implementing a basic projectile in our pygames. So I'm going to go ahead and define this class. What we want from our projectiles in this case is we want it to either move in the X or Y direction, so the horizontal or vertical axis. The only parameters we need to pass into this class will be the starting position of the projectile, but also the axis which we wish it to travel. I'm going to make the default being X, but alternatively this could be Y. I will save these parameters into the class because we'll be using them in our other methods. So that's the position, the axis, and we're also going to define the speed of the projectile, so 5 pixels per update of the game loop. In our update function or update method, we're going to have a very simple logic that's going to say move projectile in X or Y direction. Okay, so if self.axis equals X, we want to move our projectile in the X axis. How do we do this? Well, we're going to render our projectile in the position of pos. So what we can do is we can update our pos, and we want to update the first entry because that represents the X coordinate. So we're going to say each update of the loop, we're going to update this X position by self.speed. And we can do exactly the same thing in the Y direction. But the only difference is we're going to move the Y position of the projectile, which is represented by the second coordinate in our pos list, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to move it each time by self.speed. The only thing to note here is that, of course, the 0 Y coordinate is actually at the top of the screen, so when we increase this Y coordinate, our projectile will move down the screen. Finally, we need a method for rendering this projectile onto the screen. So actually I'm going to pass in the screen as a parameter, and in this case I'm just going to draw a circle which will represent our projectile and render that onto the screen. I'm going to make this a yellow projectile, and where do we want to render it? Well, we want to render it in self.pos, which is our coordinates which will update every game loop. Finally, we just need to give it, because it's a circle, we need to give it a radius. I'm just going to say give this a radius of 20. And that's all we need to define our basic projectile that can move either in a vertical or horizontal direction. I've already created a main game loop. I don't want to really go through it. The code will be available on GitHub. It's pretty bare bones and simple. It just has a section for updating and drawing the projectiles, and I've put in a bit of code here so I know where to add my projectile. So I'm going to say, so every time the player presses space key, I'm going to add a projectile to my projectiles list. So we need to give it a starting position. Let's choose our first one to move in the horizontal direction. So let's say good starting position might be the left side of the screen and about halfway up the screen, because I've made the screen 1000 by 1000. And I'm just going to explicitly write this as X. So we can go ahead and run this, which will generate our game and our screen. And now when I press the spacebar, it's going to fire these projectiles from the left side to the right side of the screen. just to finish this basic projectile example, I'm going to add in another projectile, this one being in the Y direction. So I'm going to make it go from the center, the middle of the screen, the middle width, that is, and at the bottom of the screen. So this projectile is going to move down the screen, and I'm going to make it in the Y direction. And there we go. When I press spacebar, we have two projectiles initializing in our game, one going in the horizontal direction and one going in the vertical direction. And that's all there is to basic projectiles. Now we can start coding the second type of projectile that I mentioned in the introduction, and that's the projectile which will be defined between 2 points, for example between the player and the mouse position. I'm going to call this class a linear projectile, and for the initialization logic, previously we had the starting position of the projectile and then also the axis which we wanted the projectile to travel across. This time we also want to pass it the starting position, but the difference is here that rather than an axis, we're going to pass it another coordinate position which the projectile will move towards. Again, I'm going to save the position. Small typo. Save the position inside the class because we'll be using that later. And what I'm going to do now is a few calculations for calculating the angle at which we need to shoot the projectile between the position and the target position. I'm not going to go into the mathematics in much detail in this video, mainly because some people might not be interested in the mathematics and the video will basically become too long. So I'm going to do a separate video, which I'm working on now, to explain kind of with drawings and graphs exactly why these mathematics work. But for now you're just going to have to trust me. So the first thing we need to calculate is the x delta, so the difference in x position between the target pos and the starting position. We do a similar thing with the y, but this time we take the negative. Again, that will be explained more thoroughly in a separate video. Then we can calculate the angle of the projectile. So we're going to need the math package. So math dot, and the function we're looking for is a tan 2, the arctan. And first position is the y delta, and then the x delta. And we also need to add on a small pi over 2, which is in radians, so that's 90 degrees in normal angles. Like the previous projectile, we're going to also define a speed. So I'm going to call that 5 again. Now we can do our update method. And in this update method, rather than updating the x and y position like we did in the basic projectile, what we want to say is we want our projectile to move a distance of self.speed every time the game updates. So how we do that, so I'm just going to write this in a comment. So distance projectile will travel each update. And so what we want to do is actually think about, so we want, rather than the x and y, we want the hypotenuse. So think about each time the projectile updates, it's going to move to a new coordinate position. By linking those two coordinate positions, we get the hypotenuse, and we want this hypotenuse to equal the speed of the projectile. So we're going to set h equals self.speed. Then what we can do is use trigonometry to calculate the incremental changes of x and y. So we can do this like so. So the x increment equals the hypotenuse multiplied by first the sine of self.theta, and then a similar calculation for the y, but this time using the cosine. Again, this will be fully explained in a separate video. And then finally, now that we have this x and y incremental change, we can update the projectile's position. So self.pos, firstly in the x coordinate, we're going to increase that by the x increment, and also then do it for the y, so like so. That's all of the updating done, and this will ensure that every time the game updates, this projectile will move 5 pixels towards the target position, and we're going to use exactly the same draw logic. Draw self screen, so pygame draw circle, and that's drawing onto the screen. Yellow projectile again. Self.pos radius equal to 20. Okay, so that looks okay. We can now go to the main script. I've imported everything from projectiles, and I can create a linear projectile. We're going to go for the projectile is going to start in the middle of the screen, the proper center, and it's going to move towards the mouse position. So I've already defined the position of the mouse here, and we're just going to pass it that. Just going to run the script, and now every time I press enter, it will fire a projectile towards the mouse. I just want to wrap up and say thank you very much for watching. I really hope it was useful, and that some of you can use this code or these ideas in your pygames. Please leave me a message or any feedback if you felt like something wasn't clear or you enjoyed the video. I would really appreciate that. Like I said in the video, I will be making a separate video that will be a more visual mathematical explanation of projectiles. So yeah, keep a lookout for that, because it'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Okay, thanks.